Welcome, friends. Come in and get comfortable. Whether you're curled beneath a blanket resting against a pillow or simply sitting in the evening light after a long day, I'm glad you are here. Let the room around you grow quiet. Let the sounds of night settle into the distance. Perhaps rain touches the glass or the house is already quiet, but for a while, there is nowhere else you need to be. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into the past, and let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Allow your thoughts to drift backward beyond electric lamps and panes of glass, beyond modern locks and painted hallways into a world of stone walls, smoky rafters, muddy lanes, and doors heavy enough to remember generations of hands. Tonight we are stepping into the medieval home not through its grandest chamber or warmest hall, but through the places where inside and outside met. A doorway, a shuttered opening, a narrow window cut into timber or stone. These seem ordinary to us now, yet to many people in the Middle Ages they were uncertain places. They marked the edge of safety. Beyond them waited wind-rain strangers, sickness, darkness, and perhaps other things that could not be easily named. A medieval household did not think of the home as sealed away from the world. Walls might be thick, but roofs leaked. Smoke found a path beneath the beams. Cold crept through cracks in the wattle and daub. Rushes spread across the floor, carried the smells of damp earth, old herbs, spilled ale, and yesterday's ashes. Even in a manor house, the boundary between shelter and wilderness was never complete. Doors and windows were openings in the fragile skin of the household. At dawn, a door admitted work. Servants crossed the threshold, carrying split wood pails of water baskets to eggs, or bundles of kindling. At midday it admitted gossip from the market square, and news from travellers who had passed a roadside shrine or paid a toll at the bridge. At evening, however, the meaning changed. Once the last bell had faded from the church tower and the fields beyond the village turned grey, the same opening could feel less welcoming. No one can quite agree how deeply every medieval person feared these boundaries. Beliefs changed from region to region, and even from one household to the next. A monk educated in Latin scripture might dismiss a neighbour's story about wandering spirits, then quietly make the sign of the cross before closing a gate at night. A manor steward might laugh at an old charm nailed above a kitchen door, yet refuse to remove it. People could be sceptical and cautious at the same time. The doorway had a special character because every life entered through it. A bride crossed it into a new household. Beggars waited beside it. Priests blessed it, and tax collectors knocked upon it. The dead might leave through a particular entrance, after which the living sometimes preferred another way. Thresholds also attracted small customs. Salt might be scattered nearby because it was thought to trouble harmful forces. Iron nails or fragments of old blades could be fixed into the wood, for iron had a reputation as a defence against the uncanny. Sprigs of rowan or hawthorn might be tucked near the lintel. Historians still debate how many such customs were truly medieval, yet concealed objects found beneath floors and inside walls suggest that some households treated entrances with unusual care. Windows were even more uncertain. Many poorer homes had no glass at all. An opening could be closed with a wooden shutter, oiled cloth-thin skin or woven screen. By day it brought light beneath soot-dark rafters, and allowed someone stirring pottage to see who approached. It carried monastery bells and market cries, yet also admitted draughts, insects, dampness, and the night air many believed could carry illness. The fear was not always supernatural. A roadside window might invite thieves to study the household. A door onto a muddy alley could bring animals or unwanted attention. In winter, an exposed entrance let snow blow across the threshold and freeze in the rushes. Practical danger and spiritual unease often settled together until no one could easily tell where one ended and the other began. Imagine a village after sunset. The last smoke rises pale above the thatched roofs. Somewhere a cow shifts in its stall. A wooden shutter closes with a dull knock, then another farther down the lane. Inside, families sit near low fires eating pottage from shared bowls or scraping crumbs from bread trenchers. Beeswax candles are rare in many homes, so the light comes from tallow rushlights or the fading glow of the hearth. Outside, the road disappears into mist. At such an hour a door was not opened casually. A late knock might belong to a pilgrim, a neighbour, a midwife, or a traveller seeking shelter. It might also bring a stranger whose story could not be checked until morning. Hospitality was a Christian duty, but prudence had its own voice. Some households spoke through the closed door before lifting the bar. Others peered through a crack in the shutter. A dog's reaction might be watched closely, for animals were sometimes thought to sense danger before people did. Certain entrances slowly gathered reputations. A north-facing door might be blamed for cold and illness. A window overlooking a churchyard might remain shuttered after dark. A gate near a crossroads could be avoided because crossroads were places of travel, burial punishment, and rumour. One family might refuse to use a side door after a death. Another might insist that a visitor enter by the front on a holy day, because the wrong threshold seemed capable of turning good fortune aside. Some chroniclers claim that fear of doors and windows belonged mainly to the ignorant, yet written records rarely capture the full life of ordinary households. The habits of servants, widows, shepherds, craftsmen, and village elders often survived not in books but in repeated gestures. A hand touching the lintel, a prayer whispered while fastening a shutter, a charm left undisturbed beneath a sill. And so the medieval house settled into darkness, neither fully secure nor entirely afraid. Its oak door stood barred, its shutters pressed against the wind, and its fire sank beneath the blackened beams. Beyond the walls, fields, roads, graves, forests, and distant watchfires entered the silence of night. The sense of caution surrounding doors and windows began quite naturally with the materials from which they were made. A medieval opening was rarely a simple regular shape. It belonged to the wall around it, and the wall belonged to the skills, wealth, and landscape of the people who raised it. In a timber cottage, the doorway might lean slightly beneath the weight of the roof. In a stone manor, it might be framed by carefully cut blocks and sheltered beneath a shallow arch. In a castle, it could be narrow, reinforced, and placed where anyone approaching would be easily seen. Most ordinary doors were made from oak, elm, or whatever durable timber could be obtained nearby. Oak was valued because it resisted wear and carried great weight, but not every village had enough good oak to use it freely. A poorer household might build a door from several rough planks held together by horizontal battens. The planks swelled in wet weather, shrank during dry summers, and gradually twisted with age. Gaps opened between them, admitting thin lines of a light cold air and the smell of the yard. These doors were not always hung on the neat metal hinges familiar today. Iron was expensive, and the work of a skilled smith added further cost. Some doors turned on wooden pivots fitted into sockets above and below. Others were attached with leather straps or simple iron hinges forged in a village workshop. When the hinge pins wore loose, the door sagged toward the floor, scraping across the rushes or packed earth every time it opened. That scraping sound became part of daily life. It accompanied the first servant leaving before sunrise, the return of children gathering sticks, and the evening arrival of animals brought close to shelter. In a manor kitchen, a side door might open dozens of times while cooks carried in sacks of grain, smoked fish onions, and barrels of ale. Each opening allowed smoke to escape, but it also let the wind scatter ash across the floor. A door could be heavy without being secure. Many were fastened from within by a wooden bar that slid into brackets fixed across the wall. This was simple, strong and reliable, but only when someone was already inside. From the outside, a household might rely on a wooden latch, a cord drawn through a small hole, or a lock made by a local smith. Elaborate locks existed especially in castles, abbeys, churches, and wealthy houses, yet ordinary people often depended more upon neighbours' dogs and the difficulty of moving a thick door quietly. Keys were important objects. A large iron key could signal authority within a household. The woman responsible for stores might carry several at her belt, opening chests, cupboards, pantries, and rooms where food or cloth was kept. In a monastery, a cellarer or sacristan guarded keys connected with wine-grain books, relics, and sacred vessels. Losing one could be more than an inconvenience. It could suggest carelessness, dishonesty, or even divine displeasure. Some keys were passed through families and remained in use long after the lock had become stiff. No one can quite agree how commonly keys were treated as protective charms as well as practical tools, but iron keys sometimes appear in burials, household deposits, and later folk customs. Their shape suggested control over what could enter and what must remain shut. A key did not merely open a door, it represented permission. Windows presented different difficulties. In a peasant cottage, a window might be no more than a small square cut into the wall. Large openings weakened timber frames and allowed precious warmth to escape. For this reason, windows were often narrow and placed high enough to discourage thieves. Their size also limited the amount of rain driven inside by strong winds. Glass was known throughout medieval Europe, but it was not equally available. Churches and wealthy residences could display coloured or clear panes, while humbler homes relied on wooden shutters. Some openings were covered with linen treated with oil, thin sheets of horn parchment or animal membrane. These materials softened the daylight rather than revealing a clear view. The world beyond appeared pale and blurred as though seen through mist. Horn windows were made by splitting, soaking, flattening and polishing pieces of horn until light could pass through them. They offered protection from rain while allowing a dim glow into the room. Such windows were useful in workshops, kitchens and service buildings, although their exact distribution remains uncertain. Historians continue to debate how common they were outside prosperous towns and estates. Shutters were more familiar. They could be drawn inward or outward and secured with a latch peg or bar. A well-fitted shutter kept out most rain, but even the best wood changed with the seasons. In winter it swelled and stuck. In summer it dried and left gaps. Cloth might be pushed into cracks, and wool hangings could be placed nearby to soften draughts. In castles, windows revealed status. Early stone keeps often had very small openings on lower levels, partly for defence, and partly because thick walls made large windows difficult to build. Higher chambers could have broader openings with stone seats set into the recesses. A noblewoman might sit there sewing by daylight while servants worked behind her near the fire. Yet even these windows could be bitterly cold. Glass panes were small and joined with lead, while shutters remained necessary after sunset. Monasteries used light with particular care. Cloisters, scriptoria, dormitories and chapels each required different kinds of openings. A scribe copying a manuscript needed steady daylight, but the room also had to be protected from damp, which could warp parchment and damage pigments. Some windows were covered with pale cloth or translucent material to reduce glare. Others were placed so that sunlight reached desks during particular hours. There were also openings that were not quite windows and not quite doors. Small serving hatches connected kitchens with halls. Squints cut through church walls allowed someone in a side chamber to glimpse the altar. In religious houses, turning cupboards or narrow openings could permit food and objects to pass without admitting the person outside. Such designs controlled contact, and control was often the beginning of safety. The poorest homes had little choice over orientation. A doorway faced whichever side best suited the path-yard drainage or prevailing weather. Wealthier builders could think more carefully about approach, sunlight defense, and privacy. Even so, practical design gradually gathered meanings beyond construction. A narrow rear door used by servants became socially different from the main entrance. A shutter overlooking a lane offered more risk than one facing an enclosed garden. A postern gate in a castle wall carried a different reputation from the grand gatehouse watched by guards. As evening settled, these distinctions became clearer. The main entrance might be barred with ceremony, while a kitchen door received only a peg and a muttered warning not to forget it. Shutters closed one after another as wind moved through bare trees. Firelight flickered against iron fittings, worn thresholds, and wooden beams polished by years of touch. Beyond the walls, monastery bells marked the hour, their sound passing through every crack the builders had failed to seal. Within those imperfect walls, people learned each opening by habit. They knew which hinge complained before dawn, which shutter rattled in an eastern wind, and which latch required lifting before it would catch. The house spoke through these small faults. Its doors and windows were never silent pieces of architecture. They creaked, shifted, leaked, and remembered. That familiarity made unusual behaviour seem more troubling. A door that opened by itself might simply have been warped by dampness, but some households saw warning in it. A shutter tapping at night could be moved by wind, yet the sound might still keep a sleeper awake. Construction explained much, though never quite everything. In the uncertain quiet of a medieval night, a loose hinge and an old fear could sound remarkably alike. Among the entrances that acquired uneasy reputations, the northern doorway was one of the most persistent. It was not feared everywhere, and no single explanation fits every region, but across parts of medieval Europe, north-facing doors and windows could be treated with greater caution than those turned toward the rising sun, the church, or the main village road. The practical reason was easy to understand. In many places the north brought the coldest wind. A door facing that direction admitted air that had crossed winter fields, bare woodland, and frozen marshes before finding the smallest crack in the house. Even when closed, it could tremble in its frame. Snow gathered against the threshold. Rain struck the planks at an angle, soaking the lower boards and swelling the wood until the latch became difficult to lift. A household living close to the land noticed such things carefully. The direction of the wind mattered when smoke was drawn through the roof, when grain was dried, when animals were moved, and when a fire had to last through the night. A northern opening could make the difference between a room that was merely cold and one that never seemed to warm at all. In a peasant cottage, the hearth might stand near the centre of the room, sending smoke toward a hole in the roof or through gaps beneath the thatch. There was no glass to stop every draught, and no thick carpet to protect the feet. Rushes or straw covered the packed earth floor, sometimes mixed with sweet herbs such as mint, lavender, or meadow sweet. A sudden northern gust could scatter ash, bend the rushlight flame, and carry smoke into the faces of those gathered over their pottage. This discomfort easily became associated with illness. Medieval medicine understood the body through balances, qualities, and humours. Cold air was not merely unpleasant. It could be considered actively harmful, especially when combined with dampness. It might stiffen the limbs, weaken the chest, trouble the head, or disturb a body already made vulnerable by aged childbirth, fasting, or exhaustion. A person who slept near a north-facing shutter might wake coughing and blame the direction as much as the draught. A child who fell ill after playing beside an open door might be moved closer to the hearth and wrapped in a wool blanket. Warm ale mixed with herbs could be offered, or a cloth infused with rosemary, sage, or other household plants might be placed against the chest. Whether such remedies helped depended on the illness, but warmth itself was often valuable. Yet the north carried more than weather. In Christian thought, direction could hold symbolic meaning. Churches were usually arranged so that the altar stood toward the east, the direction associated with sunrise resurrection and divine light. The west, where the sun vanished, could suggest ending judgment or the fading of life. North and south acquired their own associations, though these were neither uniform nor fixed. In some church imagery and ritual traditions, the northern side was linked with darkness, ignorance, or lands not yet brought fully into the Christian faith. Certain depictions of the Last Judgment placed the blessed and condemned according to symbolic directions. The north side of a churchyard could be less desirable for burial in some places, though the custom varied widely and changed over time. No one can quite agree how directly these religious ideas shaped household behaviour. Ordinary villagers did not necessarily follow a formal map of sacred directions, and many would have had doors facing north simply because the road slope, stream, or field demanded it. Still, sermons, church architecture, burial habits, and local stories could slowly give one direction a darker character. The landscape itself often strengthened that feeling. The main village road might run south toward the market town, while the northern track disappeared into forest or upland pasture. A doorway facing the road saw carts, pilgrims, livestock, and familiar neighbours. One facing the north might overlook empty ground, burial mounds, rough woodland, or fields where no lamps shone after sunset. Forests inspired particular caution. They provided timber berries, pasture, honey, game, and fallen branches for fuel. They were not unknown wildernesses, but they were less controlled than the ploughed fields and fenced gardens near the village. Outlaws could hide there. Wolves remained a danger in some regions. Travellers lost their way, especially in mist or snowfall. Stories gathered around old trees, spring stones, and paths that seemed older than the parish itself. A northern door opening toward such a place could feel like an invitation to uncertainty. It might be used by woodcutters at dawn or by shepherds returning from distant grazing land, yet closed firmly after evening prayer. Some families blocked unused entrances with furniture sacks of grain or stacked firewood during winter. Practical economy and superstition again move together so closely that separating them becomes difficult. The position of churchyards also mattered. When a church stood north of a cluster of houses, some doors and windows looked directly toward graves. During daylight, this was not always troubling. Sheep might graze among the stones. Children crossed the ground on errands. Widows tended family burial places. The churchyard belonged to the community as much as the market square or village well. After darkness, however, familiar ground changed. A pale stone could resemble a standing figure. Branches cast moving shadows across mounds. The sound of an animal among the graves might be mistaken for footsteps. Medieval people did not always imagine the dead as distant and silent. The departed were remembered through prayers, masses, anniversaries, alms, and stories. A soul might need help, a restless spirit might return, or a neglected grave might carry unease into the household. Some doors were therefore kept shut on nights connected with the dead or with dangerous seasonal change. Customs varied around All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day, Christmas, and the turning of winter. Lamps might be left, burning food might be set aside, prayers might be spoken, or certain entrances might be guarded more carefully. Historians continue to debate which practices were widespread and which survive mainly through later folklore. Protective marks were sometimes placed near exposed doors. A cross could be cut into the lintel. Iron nails might be driven into the frame. A sprig of blessed greenery could remain after a church festival until it had dried almost to dust. In some regions, people preserved pieces of palm yew box or other plants that had been blessed during the religious year. The exact plant mattered less than the belief that sacred protection could remain within it. The household might also hang a curtain inside the door. Such fabric softened drafts and added warmth, but it created a second boundary as well. The wooden door guarded the house from the outer world, while the hanging separated the living space from the uncertain cold beyond it. When someone entered, the curtain moved before the newcomer was fully seen, which could make even an ordinary visitor appear briefly mysterious. In manor houses, the northern side often contained service spaces, storage rooms, stairs, or lesser entrances, while more comfortable chambers were positioned to receive better light. This was not a universal rule, but builders understood the value of sunlight. A south-facing room could be brighter and warmer. A northern chamber might remain damp enough to spoil cloth rust metal or encourage mold on stored grain. Servants knew which passages were unpleasant in winter. They hurried through them, carrying trenchers, candles, linens, or buckets. A side door facing north might be reserved for deliveries, refuse, or stable work. Its lower status could add to its reputation. The grand entrance welcomed guests beneath carved stone or painted timber, while the northern door received muddy boots, dripping cloaks, and whatever the household preferred not to display. By night the distinction deepened. Firelight remained in the hall, glowing against benches and worn wooden tables. Beyond the northern door the wind moved through hedges and rattled bare branches. A watchfire burned faintly near a distant manor or fortified house. Somewhere beyond the fields, a bell marked the hour softened by mist. The door itself did nothing. It was only oak iron, leather, and habit. Yet people lived through repeated winters, illnesses, funerals, and stories, and the meaning of a place was formed by what happened near it. A child remembered a grandmother warning him not to open the northern shutter after dark. A servant remembered hearing a late knock during a storm. A widow remembered the cold morning when a body had been carried through that entrance. Over generations, such memories settled into custom. The door remained closed not because everyone believed the same tale, but because no one wished to be the first to test whether the tale had been mistaken. In a world where the night was deep, the road uncertain, and the wind capable of entering through the smallest flaw, caution required very little effort. The wooden bar was lowered, the curtain drawn, and the northern darkness was left outside until morning. The same caution that kept a northern doorway barred could settle just as easily upon a window overlooking the churchyard. During daylight, such a view was often ordinary. The church stood near the centre of village life, and the ground around it held not only graves but paths, grazing animals, meetings, errands, and familiar faces. A woman carrying bread to a neighbour might cross between the mounds. A clerk might hurry toward the porch with a bundle of parchment beneath his cloak. Children could pass along the wall while collecting kindling or searching for a missing hen. From inside a cottage, the churchyard window might even offer reassurance. It allowed the household to see the bell tower, watch the priest arrive, and notice when people gathered for worship or burial. Its sound carried the rhythm of the day. Bells called the living to prayer marked death, warned of danger, and measured hours in a world where few possessed any other clock. A family eating pottage beneath soot-dark rafters could hear the familiar ringing and know that the village still moved according to its accustomed order. Yet the view changed when evening drew the colour from the fields. Graves that appeared low and harmless by day became pale shapes beneath the moon. Wooden crosses leaned at uncertain angles. Yew branches moved above the church wall, and mist collected close to the earth. A shutter left open after sunset offered no clear image, only fragments, a white stone, a dark trunk, a movement too distant to identify. For many medieval people, the dead had not vanished completely from the community. They remained present through names, anniversaries, prayers, debts, property, and memory. A deceased father might still be mentioned when a field boundary was disputed. A mother's spindle could pass to her daughter. A brother's cloak might be altered and worn by someone else. Beds, bowls, chests, and tools lasted longer than many lives, keeping the touch of the dead among the living. Christian teaching offered hope for the soul, but it also encouraged continued responsibility towards those who had died. Masses could be requested. Candles were lit, alms were given, prayers were spoken for souls believed to be undergoing purification. The wealthy founded chantries or left money for repeated services, while poorer families remembered the dead in simpler ways, perhaps by offering bread, attending an anniversary mass, or pausing at a familiar grave. No one can quite agree how often ordinary villagers expected the dead to appear visibly. Clergy warned against improper beliefs, and many ghost stories were recorded by educated writers for moral purposes rather than as simple reports. Still, such stories suggest a world in which the boundary between grave and household could feel thin. A returning spirit might seek prayer, reveal an injustice, warn of danger, or trouble those who had failed to fulfill a promise. A window facing the burial ground therefore carried a special unease. Unlike a door, it did not need to be opened for something to be seen. A person seated beside the hearth might glance toward the dark opening and imagine a face beyond it. A sleeper might wake to moonlight on the wall and mistake the shape of a shutter latch for a hand. The fear lay not only in what might enter, but in what the household might witness. Some families closed churchyard shutters before the last light faded, even during warm weather. The room then became stuffy, especially when several people slept together on straw mattresses or wool-filled bedding. Yet stale warmth could seem preferable to a clear view of the graves. A cloth might be hung across the opening if the shutter was broken, or a bench could be pushed against it to prevent the wind from forcing it open. Small protective acts gathered around such windows. A cross might be traced on the frame with chalk charcoal or a fingertip. Blessed wax from a church candle could be kept nearby. In some households, a fragment of a saint's image, a written prayer, or a scrap bearing sacred words was placed within a wall or chest. Learned clergy did not always approve of these objects when they were treated as charms, but the distinction between prayerful protection and superstition was not always clear to the people using them. Certain herbs also carried reputations for guarding the home. Rue, rosemary, verveine, or branches of thorn might be kept near openings depending on region and season. Some were valued medicinally, some symbolically, and some simply because older relatives had always used them. Historians continue to debate how far later customs can be traced safely into the Middle Ages, yet the habit of blessing, marking, and protecting vulnerable places appears repeatedly in many forms. The churchyard itself was not always peaceful. Burial ground could be crowded, especially in old parishes where generations had been placed within a limited space. Graves were reopened. Bones were moved to charnel houses or stored near churches. Earth disturbed by new burial might expose fragments from earlier ones. To medieval eyes, this was not necessarily shocking in the modern sense. The body returned to earth and burial space belonged to the whole community. Even so, the sight of bones could deepen the solemn character of the place. Skulls and long bones sometimes appeared in religious imagery as reminders of mortality. A person passing a charnel house was encouraged to remember that wealth, strength, and beauty would fade. Such reminders were meant to guide the soul, yet at night they could also trouble the imagination. Windows overlooking ruined chapels carried a related fear. A chapel might fall out of use because a manor was abandoned, a settlement moved, or a religious house declined. Its roof could collapse, leaving grass inside the walls. Birds nested where candles once burned. The altar stone might remain cracked and damp while the path vanished beneath nettles. People sometimes avoided looking toward such places after dark. The concern was not merely that a ghost might wander there, but that sacred ground had become neglected. A church or chapel was supposed to be ordered by prayer bells' light and human presence. When those things ceased, the empty structure seemed caught between holiness and ruin. Some chroniclers claimed that strange lights, voices, or processions were seen near abandoned religious sites, though those who recorded the stories never fully agreed on what had occurred. Execution grounds were still more troubling. Gallows often stood outside town walls beside major roads, or on elevated land where they could be seen. Their purpose was public warning. Bodies might remain displayed after death, and those denied burial in consecrated ground became the subjects of particular unease. A window facing such a place could be avoided, especially by travellers staying in an inn, or by households living near the edge of a settlement. The practical fear was strong enough. Execution places attracted scavenging animals, unpleasant smells, and people whose presence might be dangerous. Yet spiritual anxiety followed. Those who died violently without confession or proper rites were sometimes thought more likely to remain restless. A shutter closed against the gallows protected the room from sight as much as from air. In wealthier houses, glass did not entirely remove this discomfort. A glazed window could still frame the churchyard like a dim picture. Leaded panes broke the view into small sections and imperfections in the glass-distorted movement outside. Candlelight reflected from within, so that a person looking toward the graves might first see his own pale face floating over the darkness. There was a gentle cruelty in such moments. The window showed the dead and the living together, one reflected upon the other. A servant carrying a beeswax candle through a manor chamber might glimpse herself in the pane with the church tower behind her shoulder. For an instant it could seem that someone stood beside her. Most likely she knew it was only reflection, yet knowledge didn't always quiet the heart. Far across the village, rain began to touch the church roof. Water ran from stone gutters and darkened the walls. The bell rope hung motionless inside the tower. One by one, household lights disappeared behind shutters, leaving only the priest's lamp, a watchfire near the road, or the faint glow of an inn beyond the square. The graveyard remained where it had always been, holding ancestors, neighbours, strangers, infants, craftsmen, widows, and lords beneath the same wet earth. It did not need to be imagined as evil. More often it inspired a quieter caution, respect mixed with uncertainty, memory mixed with fear, and so the window was closed. The latch settled into place. A wool curtain softened the draught, and the household turned back toward the hearth. Outside, rain passed over stones worn smooth by generations, while the sleeping village kept the dead nearby, though not always within sight. Once darkness had settled beyond the shutters, another fear entered the medieval household, the fear of the air itself. Night air was colder, damper, and more difficult to understand than the warmth gathered around a hearth. It moved without being seen, slipped through cracks no hand could reach, and carried smells from marshes, middens, stables, graves, and stagnant ditches. To many medieval people, such air was not empty. It possessed qualities that could strengthen the body, weaken it, or quietly bring disease. The belief was not foolish when judged only by experience. People noticed that certain places made them ill more often than others. Low ground near marshes brought fevers. Crowded lanes smelled worse in summer. Rooms with poor ventilation became heavy with smoke. Rotting refuse attracted insects and animals. Yet without knowledge of bacteria, viruses, or parasites, these observations were explained through corrupted air, poisonous vapors, and dangerous imbalances in the body. Physicians trained in the learned traditions of their age spoke of airs, waters, seasons, and humours. Health depended upon maintaining a balance among qualities such as heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. A damp chill entering through an open window could be blamed for weakness of the lungs or pain in the joints. Foul air rising from decay might be thought to carry corruption into the body. No one can quite agree how closely ordinary villagers followed formal medical theory. Most could not read a physician's book, and many never consulted a university-trained doctor. Still, ideas travelled through sermons, household remedies, midwives, barbers, monks, and travelling healers. A mother did not need to know the language of humours to believe that her coughing child should be moved away from a draught. As evening approached, windows were managed with care. A shutter might remain open while cooking smoke filled the room, then close once the fire had settled. In a small cottage, this created an uncomfortable choice. Leaving the opening uncovered allowed cold and dampness to enter. Closing it trapped smoke-sweat animal smells and the steam of boiling pottage beneath soot-dark rafters. Many households shared living space with animals, especially in winter. A cow, goat, or pig might be kept behind a low partition or in an adjoining bay. Wet wool cloaks hung near the fire. Boots carried mud from the lane. Straw bedding held moisture. Fish smoked above the hearth, while onions, herbs, leather, tallow, and ale each added their own quiet presence to the room. To those who lived within it, the familiar smells of the household could suggest warmth and safety. It was the unfamiliar smell drifting in from outside that caused greater concern. A sour odour from a ditch, a strange sweetness near decay, or smoke from an unknown fire beyond the fields could be taken as a warning. During outbreaks of disease, fear of the air grew stronger. Town authorities sometimes ordered streets cleaned and refuse removed because foul surroundings were believed to corrupt the atmosphere. Fires of aromatic wood or herbs could be burned. Rooms might be fumigated with juniper, rosemary, frankincense, or whatever fragrant material could be afforded. Wealthy people carried scented pomanders, while poorer households relied on vinegar, smoke, and common plants. Some chroniclers claim that pleasant smells protected the body by driving away poisonous vapours. Others advised keeping windows closed when plague or fever was believed to be nearby. Yet complete sealing was impossible. Medieval walls breathed through every joint, roof, and board. A household could bar the door, stuff cloth into cracks, and hang wool over a shutter, but the outside world still entered in faint currents. The direction and hour of the air mattered. Dawn might be considered safer than midnight. A breeze from open fields could be preferred to one crossing a graveyard or stagnant pool. Mist inspired particular unease because it made air visible without revealing what it contained. When mist crept over winter fields and gathered along the village lane, it seemed almost like a substance searching for openings. People hung herbs near windows not only as charms but as practical scents. Lavender, mint rue, wormwood, and rosemary could freshen a room, discourage insects, or provide material for remedies. Bundles dried from rafters beside onions and strips of smoked meat. Their shadows moved in the firelight whenever a hidden draught entered. A sick room demanded even greater caution. The patient might lie beneath wool blankets with a fur-lined cloak placed over the bedding during severe cold. Curtains around a bed reduced draughts and offered privacy, but they also held heat and stale air. Attendants debated whether to open a shutter briefly or keep the room sealed. Even now, historians continue to debate how consistently medical advice was followed, especially where comfort depended more upon weather and fuel than upon theory. A priest visiting the sick brought prayers, holy water, or the Eucharist, while family members prepared broth, warm ale, and herbal mixtures. A bowl of vinegar might be set nearby. Cloths infused with herbs could be placed against the forehead. If the patient worsened after a window had been opened, the draught might be remembered as the cause whether or not it had any true connection. Night magnified these concerns. After sunset, familiar roads disappeared and smells carried on. The wind became difficult to locate. Smoke from a charcoal burner, a tanner's yard, or damp leaves might reach a house without explanation. Dogs barked toward darkness. A shutter moved against its latch. The flame of a rushlight bent suddenly, proving that some unseen current had crossed the room. There were also beliefs that harmful spirits travelled upon the wind. Church teaching warned against treating weather as a magical force, yet older customs and local stories persisted. Storms might be connected with restless souls, witches, demons, or divine judgment. Certain winds were said to bring quarrels, madness, or illness. Those who recorded such claims never fully agreed on where medicine ended and superstition began. Beyond the walls, night air moved over frozen furrows, abbey roofs, and silent market stalls. It passed through bare forests and along pilgrimage roads where travellers searched for an inn before the gates were closed. Bells sounded faintly across the mist, each note softened by distance, until it seemed part of the weather itself. Inside the village, houses' openings were checked once more. A peg was pressed firmly into place. A folded cloth filled a gap beside the frame. The fire was covered with ash so that embers might survive until morning. Children settled beneath shared blankets, and older people drew nearer to the hearth. The closed window did not guarantee health, nor did the barred door defeat every danger. Yet these acts gave shape to uncertainty. They allowed a household to believe that the cold, damp foulness and invisible corruption of night had been kept beyond the wooden frame. For a few quiet hours the room belonged to firelight, familiar breath, and sleep, while the restless air wandered outside among the roofs and fields. In some medieval households, one entrance was remembered differently from all the others. It might be a side door opening toward the yard, a narrow passage beside the hall, or an old doorway that had once served a room no longer used. On ordinary days it remained closed. Dust settled along its lower boards, cobwebs gathered near the hinges, and a chest might stand before it. Yet when death entered the household, this forgotten opening could become important again. The body of the dead had to leave the house, but the manner of that departure carried meaning. In many places, the corpse was taken through the usual doorway, accompanied by relatives, neighbours, clergy, candles, and prayers. Elsewhere, custom favoured a lesser entrance, perhaps to keep death from passing through the same threshold, used for weddings, hospitality, and daily work. The practice was never universal, and historians continue to debate how widespread special corpse doors truly were. Some entrances later given that name may simply have been practical side doors. A body wrapped in a shroud or placed upon a board was not easy to carry through a crowded room. Benches, chests, trestle tables, and hanging cloths narrowed the way. In poorer homes, the bed itself might occupy much of the interior. A side entrance offered a straighter path into the yard where neighbours waited to join the procession toward the church. The preparation of the dead usually took place within the home. Family members or local women washed the body, closed the eyes, arranged the hands, and wrapped the remains in linen or wool, according to means and custom. Herbs might be used to soften unpleasant smells. Rosemary, lavender, rue, or other plants could be placed nearby, though the exact practice varied greatly. Beeswax candles, when affordable, burned near the body, while poorer households relied on tallow or rushlights whose flames trembled in every draught. Death did not stop the ordinary work of the household. Pottage still had to be stirred, animals needed feeding, water had to be carried from the well, and bread could not be left too long in the oven. Yet every familiar task felt altered by the presence of the covered form. Voices softened. A bench was moved. The best cloth available might be spread beneath the body. Neighbours entered quietly, crossing themselves or whispering a prayer for the soul. A door chosen for the funeral could gather memory afterward. The threshold remembered the morning when a father was carried out beneath winter rain, or the evening when a child left the house, while the church bell sounded slowly across the fields. Even when the wood was replaced, the place itself retained its reputation. Families might avoid using it unless necessary, not because a formal rule demanded this, but because ordinary passage through it felt disrespectful or unlucky. Some believed that the dead should not be allowed to remember the route back into the home. The body might therefore be carried feet first, turned at the threshold, or taken by an entrance rarely used in life. No one can quite agree how old or common these customs were, and many are better documented in later folklore than in medieval records. Still, they reveal a persistent concern the newly dead had crossed a boundary, and the household wished that crossing to remain complete. Christian teaching emphasized prayer, judgment, burial, and the fate of the soul rather than tricks meant to confuse a ghost. Clergy could condemn superstitious funeral acts, yet parish religion often lived beside local custom. A priest might lead the procession with a cross while a relative quietly touched iron before the body passed. Holy words and inherited precautions did not always seem contradictory to those who practiced both. Bells announced the death, and the corpse might rest on a bier carried by neighbours. A rosary or pilgrim badge might accompany the dead as relatives followed the muddy lane toward the stone church. Behind them the house stood strangely open. Cold air entered the room. A dog searched for the familiar person who no longer answered. The straw mattress might soon be emptied or burned if sickness was feared. Bedding could be washed, aired, or passed to relatives. Bowls returned to shelves, stools were set back in place, and the fire was built up again. Daily life slowly closed around the absence. The special door might remain unfastened until the burial was complete. Some families feared shutting it too quickly, as though the soul needed freedom to depart. Others barred it immediately after the body crossed the threshold, preventing anything from following the mourners back inside. Those who recorded such beliefs never fully agreed, and customs could differ between neighbouring villages. Protective marks sometimes appeared around funeral entrances. A small cross might be cut into the frame. Holy water could be sprinkled near the sill. Iron nails were occasionally kept close to doors, though their purpose is often uncertain. An old piece of metal could serve as repair memory and charm at the same time. In castles, rank shaped the route of death, while monasteries followed, ordered passages between infirmary, church, and burial ground. Bells gave structure to grief as they did to prayer and labour. Outside evening settled over the roofs. The funeral path passed the market cross and climbed toward the church. Candle flames leaned in the wind. Beyond the wall, graves waited beneath damp grass while bare branches moved against the fading sky. When the mourners returned, they came back through the living entrance. Food might be shared, ale poured, and memories repeated beside the hearth. The unused door stood apart, its boards dark with rain, holding the moment of departure in silence. Years later, a child might ask why no one opened it. An elder might answer with a family story, or merely say that it was better left alone. And so one doorway could become a quiet memorial. It separated not only inside from outside, but the time before death from the time after it. The house continued around that boundary, filled again with smoke, work, meals, prayer, and sleep. Yet the closed door remained, preserving the footsteps of those who'd crossed it once and were not expected to return. Long after a funeral door had been closed and the household returned to its ordinary rhythm, other forms of protection remained hidden around the entrances. Some were visible to anyone who crossed the threshold: a carved cross, a sprig of greenery, or a strip of cloth tied near the latch. Others were concealed so carefully that they might not be discovered until centuries later, when a wall was repaired, a floor lifted, or an old chimney dismantled. Doors and windows were natural places for such objects because they were openings in the shelter of the home. A wall kept the outside world at a distance, but a threshold had to allow passage. Every visitor, animal, gust of wind, rumour, illness, and piece of news entered through one of these vulnerable points. Protecting the frame therefore seemed almost as important as strengthening the door itself. A household might begin with a simple sign of faith: Crosses were scratched into lintels, doorposts, shutters, and beams. Some were cut deeply with a knife. Others were little more than repeated lines worn into the wood. A cross could mark a blessing, commemorate a prayer, or serve as a plea for protection. Yet historians continue to debate the meaning of many surviving marks. What appears sacred may sometimes have been a carpenter's guide, an owner's mark, or idle scratching. A cluster of circles and intersecting lines beside a doorway might have been intended to trap harmful forces in an endless pattern. Such designs are sometimes called apotropaic marks, meaning marks meant to turn away evil. Compass-drawn circles, daisy-like wheels, grids, and overlapping crosses appear in houses, churches, barns, castles, and caves. No one can quite agree when every example was made, or what each meant to the person who carved it. These signs were often placed where danger seemed most likely to enter, beside locks above hearths, near windows, and along doorways. Fireplaces required particular care because a chimney was another open path between the household and the sky. Marks around both chimney and door created a ring of caution around the home's weakest boundaries. Objects hidden within the structure carried still more private meanings. Worn shoes have been discovered inside walls, beneath floorboards, and near chimneys in old buildings. They were often single shoes rather than pairs, softened by long use and shaped to the foot of the person who wore them. Their exact purpose remains uncertain. Some may have been discarded during repairs, but careful placement suggests that at least some were concealed deliberately. A shoe carried the impression of a human body. It had crossed roads, church porches, muddy yards, market squares, and fields. Perhaps this personal shape was believed to confuse or repel a harmful spirit. Perhaps the shoe represented the household itself standing guard when its owner slept. Those who placed such objects left no written explanation, so the old leather remained silent within the timber. Iron was another favoured material. Bent nails, broken knife blades, shears, keys, and fragments of tools could be placed near entrances. Iron had practical strength, but it also possessed a reputation for troubling fairies, spirits, witches, and other uncertain beings in later folklore. Medieval evidence is uneven, and some customs are more securely documented after the Middle Ages. Even so, iron objects were too valuable to discard, casually making their concealment in unusual places suggestive. Animal remains were sometimes hidden as well. Cats, birds, bones, and skulls have been found sealed into buildings, though many examples are difficult to date. Their purpose is uncertain. Some may have guarded against vermin or misfortune, while others may simply have become trapped. Less disturbing protections were renewed with the seasons. Green branches blessed at church could be brought home and fastened above an entrance. Palm was used where available, but in colder regions, yew-box willow or another local plant might stand in its place. The branch slowly dried over the year, gathering dust and smoke above the household's daily comings and goings. Herbs hung near windows served several purposes at once. Rue rosemary, mugwort, sage, and wormwood could be used in remedies scattered among rushes burned for their scent or kept as protection. A bundle beside a shutter might discourage insects while also reassuring the family that the opening had been guarded. Written words offered another form of defense. A priest, clerk, monk, or literate healer might prepare a short prayer or sacred phrase to be carried in a pouch or placed near a doorway. Saints' names or scriptural phrases could appear on parchment, lead wood, or cloth. Some churchmen approve such prayers while others condemn their use as magical objects. Householders did not always understand that distinction. A strip bearing holy words could seem protective because it had been written, blessed touch to a relic or obtained during pilgrimage. A pilgrim badge above a door might recall Canterbury, Santiago, Rome, or a nearby shrine connecting the humble room with distant sacred places. Daily life continued beneath these objects. Bread was cut upon worn boards, ale was poured into wooden cups, wet cloaks steamed beside the fire, servants shook old rushes from the floor and spread fresh ones mixed with herbs. Children ran through the doorway without noticing the marks above their heads, while an elder might touch the lintel each morning from habit. At night the protection seemed more important. Wind moved along the lane and pressed against the shutters. A dog turned twice beside the hearth before lying down. The last monastery bell passed over the sleeping fields, thin and distant. Firelight climbed the wall, briefly revealing a carved wheel near the door before darkness covered it again. Most charms did not announce themselves. They waited inside plaster timber and stone close to the places where the house opened onto uncertainty. Whether the people who placed them feared witches, sickness, misfortune, wandering spirits, or merely the unknown cannot always be recovered. The hidden object gave no promise that danger would stay away. It offered something quieter, the comfort of having acted. A nail had been driven, a prayer folded a branch, fastened a shoe sealed within the wall. The household had done what memory and custom advised. Then the bar was lowered, the candle shortened, and the old frame quietly stood guard until dawn. The charms hidden around lintels and window frames were not meant only for invisible dangers. Medieval households also feared the ordinary visitor whose intentions could not be known. A knock after sunset might belong to a pilgrim, a beggar, a wounded traveller, a wandering healer, or a thief studying the house before returning with companions. The door stood between Christian hospitality and the practical need to survive. In villages, most visitors were recognized before they reached the threshold. Neighbors knew one another's clothing, voices, animals, and manner of walking. A shepherd returning from distant pasture could be identified by his staff long before his face became clear. A widow carrying a covered bowl might be expected at the same hour each week. Familiarity offered a kind of protection, because unusual movement along the lane was quickly noticed. Strangers disturbed that order. They arrived carrying news from roads beyond the parish, but also diseases, disputes, debts, and stories no one could confirm. Pilgrims wore badges from shrines, though a badge could be bought or borrowed. Travelling craftsmen carried tools that supported their claims, yet tools could also conceal blades. Beggars displayed wounds, missing limbs, or letters requesting charity, but householders sometimes suspected that suffering had been exaggerated. Christian teaching urged mercy toward the poor and hospitality toward travellers. Monasteries maintained guest houses, hospitals, and almonaries partly in obedience to this duty. Wealthy households fed visitors according to rank, while poorer families might offer a place near the hearth, a crust of bread, or a cup of weak ale. Refusing a needy stranger could trouble the conscience, especially if the visitor invoked God, a saint, or a pilgrimage vow. Yet opening the door carried risk. A traveller admitted to the hall could observe where keys were kept, how many servants were present, and whether valuable objects rested in unlocked chests. He might notice that the household's strongest men were away at market or manor service. A thief did not need to steal immediately. Knowledge gathered beside the fire could be used later. For this reason, some exchanges took place without fully opening the door. Bread could be passed through a narrow gap. A cup might be placed outside and collected after the visitor stepped back. In monasteries and enclosed religious houses, food and messages sometimes passed through hatches designed to limit contact. The opening allowed charity while preserving distance. Dogs were useful judges of unfamiliar callers. A dog sleeping beneath a bench could wake before anyone else heard footsteps. Its bark gave the household time to rise, light a rush candle, and reach for the wooden bar. People occasionally believed that dogs sensed more than human deceit. An animal that growled at an apparently harmless stranger might be taken seriously, especially if the visitor arrived at an unusual hour. Wandering healers inspired both hope and suspicion. Many villages depended upon local women experienced midwives, herb gatherers and barbers for ordinary treatment. A stranger claiming knowledge of secret remedies could seem valuable when familiar methods failed. He might offer salves for infected wounds, powders for fever charms against toothache, or advice for sick animals. Some remedies were sensible. Honey could protect a wound, certain herbs eased pain, and splints supported broken limbs. Others relied upon prayers, symbolic numbers, astrological timing, or substances whose effects were uncertain. A healer might ask for ale eggs, cloth, or coins in return. If the patient recovered, the visitor's reputation grew. If the patient worsened, the same stranger might be blamed for bringing the illness rather than curing it. No one can quite agree how often accusations of witchcraft arose directly from such encounters. The great waves of European witch trials belonged mainly to a later period, but medieval communities still feared harmful magic curses, sorcery, and dealings with spirits. Church courts and secular authorities punished certain magical practices, though beliefs varied greatly across time and place. The suspected witch was not always an unknown traveller. More often, suspicion settled upon someone already living nearby, an isolated widow, a healer, a quarrelsome neighbour, or a person associated with repeated misfortune. A disagreement at a doorway could become important in later memory. If a woman asked for milk and was refused, then a cow sickened the following day, the refusal and the illness might be connected in gossip. Doors became stages upon which such tensions unfolded. A beggar cursed under his breath after being turned away. A neighbour stood outside demanding repayment. A stranger touched the frame while speaking words no one understood. The gestures themselves might be harmless, yet remembered differently after a child developed fever or bread failed to rise. Householders attempted to protect entrances from deliberate harm. Salt could be scattered across the threshold. Iron might be placed near the latch. Brooms were sometimes positioned close to doors, both because they belonged there and because later traditions credited them with protective power. Certain plants were hung above the frame, and holy water might be sprinkled after a troubling visitor departed. Suspicion also surrounded gifts. Food left at a doorway could be charitable, threatening, or simply unexplained. A bundle containing hair feathers, bones, wax thread, or knotted cloth might cause alarm if found beneath a sill. Such objects could have innocent origins, but people familiar with tales of binding and cursing did not always wait for an innocent explanation. Market towns presented still greater uncertainty. Their gates admitted merchants, drovers, entertainers, soldiers, clerks, pilgrims, and people displaced by hunger or war. At closing time, guards questioned those arriving late. Inns barred side entrances and stable doors were checked because thieves could enter among the animals. A traveller who missed the gate bell might spend the night outside the wall or seek shelter in a nearby barn. Within an inn, the host watched both doors and guests. Cloaks hung from pegs, boots dried near the hearth, and wooden bowls passed around tables crowded with unfamiliar hands. A merchant might sleep with his purse beneath his tunic or place his chest against the door. A pilgrim rested beside someone whose language he barely understood. Hospitality placed strangers close together, but trust remained thin. Beyond the market, roads grew dark quickly. Watchfires glowed near a manor or bridge while the forest swallowed the last light between the trees. A knock heard at such an hour carried the whole uncertainty of the road with it. The household could not know whether the caller brought need danger or merely exhaustion. Inside, the family waited beside the low fire. Someone lifted the shutter just enough to look out. Another kept a hand upon the bar. Questions were asked through the wood, the stranger's name, destination, parish, and reason for travelling so late. His answers were weighed against his clothing voice and the reaction of the dog. Sometimes the door opened and the traveller received bread ale and a place among the rushes. Sometimes it remained closed and charity was passed through the gap. On other nights no one answered at all. The decision was rarely simple. Every stranger might be a danger, but every stranger was also someone far from home, standing beneath the same cold sky. Medieval hospitality lived within that uncertainty. The threshold did not merely divide safety from danger. It asked the household to decide how much fear could be allowed to overcome mercy. Outside footsteps faded along the muddy lane. The shutter returned to its frame, the latch settled, and the rushlight burned low. Whether the visitor had been honest would perhaps never be known. The house could only close itself once more and trust the silence until morning. Monasteries faced the same uncertainty as village households, though their gates were governed by stricter rhythms. A religious house could not simply close itself against the world, for hospitality formed part of its Christian duty. Pilgrims, messengers, labourers, merchants, sick travellers, and the poor all came seeking food shelter, prayer or assistance. Yet a monastery also depended upon silence, enclosure, discipline, and the orderly passage of time. Its gate therefore stood between welcome and withdrawal. The gatehouse was often the first part of an abbey encountered from the road. In a wealthy monastery it might be built from stone with an arched entrance, chambers above, and a smaller pedestrian door set within or beside the larger gate. Lesser houses relied upon timber plaster and a strong wooden bar. The road approaching it could be deeply rutted by carts bringing grain, wine, firewood, wool, fish, and barrels of ale. Near the entrance the porter kept watch. His task required patience as much as strength. He listened for knocks, questioned travellers, carried messages, and decided whom to admit immediately, and whom to send toward the guest-house, infirmary, almonry stable, or outer court. In theory, he received every visitor with humility. In practice, he also protected the community from interruption, theft, disorder, and people whose intentions seemed doubtful. The porter's chamber might contain a stool, a lantern, a small table, keys, and perhaps a brazier during cold weather. He heard the road before he saw it. Hooves striking frozen ground, cartwheels sinking into mud, the bells of pack animals or staffs tapping as pilgrims approached. Through a narrow opening he could inspect a stranger without exposing the entire abbey. Monastic bells divided the day into hours of prayer. They called the community from sleep, labour, meals, reading, and rest. When evening offices approached, activity near the gate slowed. Workers returned tools. Lay brothers drove animals into enclosed yards. Carts were unloaded before darkness made counting difficult. The porter checked the entrance while the last light faded from the cloister walls. Closing the gate after sunset was not an act of hostility. Night travel was dangerous and those already within the monastery needed security. Stores of grain, wine, cloth wax, books, and metal objects attracted thieves. Sacred vessels and saints' relics might also be kept within the church. Even a humble house possessed food at times when nearby villagers had little. A late knock therefore required caution. The porter might ask the caller to identify himself and explain where he had come from. A monk returning from an errand could be recognized by voice clothing or a letter carried beneath his cloak. A known tenant from abbey lands might be admitted. A complete stranger faced more questions, especially if he arrived without a pilgrim staff badge companion or believable account of the road. No one can quite agree how consistently individual monasteries followed their written rules. Surviving regulations describe ideals, while real practice depended upon weather wealth, local danger, and the temperament of the officials on duty. A compassionate porter might bend the rules during a storm. Another might refuse entrance after the final bell unless the traveller appeared sick or carried urgent news. Pilgrims presented a familiar difficulty. Hospitality toward them was encouraged because pilgrimage represented devotion, penance, and spiritual longing, yet not everyone wearing a badge behaved devoutly. Some travellers moved from shrine to shrine because monastic houses offered food and lodging. Others carried forged letters or invented stories of robbery. The badge sewn to a hat or cloak proved only that an object had been obtained, not that the wearer's character was sound. When admitted, ordinary guests usually remained in outer buildings rather than entering the enclosed cloister. A guest master received them arranged sleeping places and provided food according to the resources of the house. Wealthy visitors might receive bread of finer flourfish, wine, clean linen, and a private chamber. Poor pilgrims could expect pottage, coarse bread, weak ale, and straw bedding shared with others. The distinction was accepted as part of medieval society, though religious writers sometimes warned against honouring rich guests more warmly than the poor. Christ, they reminded the brothers, might appear in the form of an insignificant traveller. Such teaching made every knock morally important, even when experience advised suspicion. Some monasteries maintained a small outer shelter, where late arrivals could wait safely until morning. Others allowed travellers to sleep near the gatehouse stable or hospital, without opening the inner precinct. A bowl of food could be passed through a hatch. Blankets might be provided through the smaller door while the main gate remained barred. The gate also regulated women's access to male monasteries and men's access to female religious houses. Rules of enclosure varied, but visitors were usually kept within appointed spaces. Messages, gifts, medicine, and food passed through controlled openings. In some convents, turning cupboards or screened hatches allowed objects to enter without direct contact between the enclosed women and those outside. These openings could inspire unease precisely because they concealed the person on the other side. A voice might be heard without a face. A loaf disappeared into a dark recess and an empty basket returned. Yet concealment supported discipline and privacy, allowing the religious community to remain connected with the world without being overwhelmed by it. Protective customs gathered around monastic gates as they did around village doors. A cross might be carved above the arch. A saint's image watched from a niche. Holy water was used in blessings and processions, sometimes passed through the entrance on important feast days. Written prayers or relics could be placed within the gatehouse chapel, offering protection that was both spiritual and institutional. Some chroniclers claimed that demons or restless spirits were especially active beyond the walls after night prayer. Monks were warned not to wander without permission, though such warnings also discouraged secret meetings, drinking, and other ordinary breaches of discipline. The supernatural and the practical again supported the same locked gate. Within the abbey night gathered slowly. A final meal had ended. Wooden bowls were washed leftovers distributed and the kitchen fire reduced to embers. Brothers crossed the cloister beneath wool cowls while rain whispered across the roof tiles. The church lamps burned before the altar and the smell of wax mixed with damp stone. At the gatehouse the porter listened once more. Far along the pilgrimage road a dog barked near a farmhouse. Wind moved through the trees beyond the outer wall. Then a staff struck the gate 3 times. The caller was perhaps a merchant delayed by mud, a pilgrim exhausted by the road, or a messenger carrying news from another abbey. The porter did not know. He approached the small opening and asked the customary questions in a quiet voice. Behind him stood the ordered world of bells, prayer-stored grain-sleeping brothers, and enclosed courtyards. Beyond the gate lay darkness, hunger, danger, and human need. The answer could not always be found in a rule. Sometimes it depended upon the weather, the hour, and the sound of honesty in a stranger's voice. At last either the smaller door opened or bread and a blanket passed through it. Then the bolts returned to their sockets. The monastery settled again beneath the night, its hospitality offered carefully, its silence preserved. until the first bell before dawn. Beyond the monastery walls, where bells and written rules governed the opening of gates, castles and manor houses developed their own geography of welcome and avoidance. The great entrance received mounted guests, supply carts, officials, and messengers beneath the eyes of guards. Smaller doors led toward kitchens, stables, towers, gardens, prisons, private chambers, and narrow stairs, where few visitors were meant to pass. A castle rarely depended upon a single gateway. The main gatehouse displayed authority as well as strength. Its oak doors were reinforced with iron straps and closed by heavy bars. Yet ordinary movement often passed through lesser entrances because opening the great gate for every servant, shepherd, or basket of eggs would have been inconvenient. The postern gate was one such entrance. Usually smaller and less impressive, it might open toward a riverbank, orchard, chapel path, or outer ditch. It allowed messengers to leave quietly and gave servants access to gardens, mills, or nearby settlements. During danger, however, the postern was a weakness. A forgotten bolt, a bribed guard, or an unlocked latch could admit enemies more quietly than an assault upon the gatehouse. For that reason, posterns were watched with suspicion. A steward might hold the key while a trusted porter checked the hinges at sunset. Some were sealed during war or used only at certain hours. No one can quite agree how often servants feared such doors for supernatural reasons, but practical danger alone gave them an uneasy character. Servants knew which entrances their masters expected them to use. Kitchen workers carried fish, onions, grain, and firewood through service doors so that mud and smoke did not pass through ceremonial spaces. Stable hands entered smelling of leather, hay, and horses. The household hierarchy could be read in its thresholds, nobles beneath carved arches, servants beside drains and wood piles. A service door might stand close to the kitchen hearth, where spits turned cauldrons simmered and soot darkened the rafters. Its constant opening brought cold air across the rush-covered floor and made rushlights gutter, yet it also released steam and smoke. During winter, coarse wool or an old tapestry could be hung behind it to soften the draught. Tower doors carried a different unease. A tower might contain storage rooms below chambers above and a spiral stair connecting them. The stair was narrow, uneven, and dim even during daylight. A servant carrying trenchers or a beeswax candle climbed slowly, one hand against the central column. Stone steps wore smooth beneath generations of feet. Some spiral stairs turned clockwise as they rose, design often explained as favouring a right-handed defender above an attacker below. Historians continue to debate how deliberately this principle was applied. In daily life, the greater danger was missing a step while carrying wine broth linen or a chamber pot. Doors opening onto these stairs were kept closed because towers trapped cold air. A latch lifting by itself could be blamed on wind. A candle extinguished in the stairwell might be explained by a hidden draught. Yet a place that was dark, isolated, and associated with prisoners or violent deaths gathered stories easily. Castle prisons were not always deep underground dungeons. Captives might be held in towers, gatehouse rooms, or secured chambers. A door once used for confinement could retain a grim reputation after the room found another purpose. Servants sent to collect stored cloth or old armour might avoid going alone. Some chroniclers claim that chains were heard moving where no prisoner remained, though such stories rarely allow certainty. Private stairs encouraged rumour as well. They allowed a lord-lady chaplain or trusted servant to move between chambers without crossing the public hall. A narrow doorway concealed behind a hanging might lead to an oratory, wardrobe, or upper room. Such passages supported privacy, but privacy invited speculation. A servant who saw someone emerge at an unusual hour might share it in the kitchen. Certain chamber doors were avoided because of sickness or death. When a noble resident died, the room might be closed while possessions were inventoried and bedding removed. If the death followed, fever cloth and straw could be burned or aired. Aromatic herbs might be scattered while vinegar and smoke were used to cleanse the space. Occasionally a chamber remained unused for years. Perhaps the roof leaked, the fireplace smoked badly, or the family associated it with an unhappy event. Practical neglect gradually invited darker explanation. A shutter banging in an abandoned room became mysterious knocking. Rats behind panelling sounded like scratching hands. An old tapestry moved because air entered through cracked mortar, though few servants wished to inspect the cause after midnight. Protective marks sometimes appeared near such entrances. Crosses, circles, or letters were cut into door frames. Iron objects might be placed beneath thresholds. A saint's image could stand in a nearby niche. Some marks were made by builders rather than frightened residents, and those who recorded them left little explanation. The castle chapel offered safer doors. Servants passing a troubling corridor might cross themselves near the chapel entrance or touch a pilgrim badge sewn inside a garment. As night settled, the castle separated into islands of light. The great hall glowed around its hearth where benches were drawn close and the last ale was poured. In the kitchen, cooks covered embers with ash. Guards climbed toward the battlements, their footsteps echoing through stone passages. Beyond the walls, watchfires burned above black fields and wind moved along the ditch. One by one, the lesser doors were checked. The postern key turned. A tower latch dropped into place. A curtain was drawn across the private stair. Servants hurried away from colder corridors towards straw mattresses and wool blankets. The avoided door was rarely forbidden by formal command. More often it was simply the entrance no one volunteered to open. Its reputation passed quietly from older servant to newcomer. The hinge failed. In winter the stair beyond was unsafe. A prisoner had died there, or someone once heard a voice behind it after the room was emptied. Whether the tale was true mattered less with each retelling. The castle contained enough doors that another route could usually be found. And so the troublesome entrance remained shut, holding its darkness behind oak and iron, while the household chose warmer passages and waited for morning. The doors that servants avoided in castles belonged to stone passages and private memories, but village thresholds gathered their meanings from the turning year. A doorway stood in the same place through planting, harvest, winter, hunger, weddings, births, funerals and feast days. Yet it was not regarded in quite the same way in every season. At certain moments when one part of life seemed to give way to another, the entrance of a house required special attention. Winter made these customs most visible. Cold weather narrowed the world around each household. Roads became deep with mud or hardened beneath frost. Work in distant fields slowed, and families spent longer hours beneath the thatch mending tools, spinning wool, preparing pottage, and feeding the fire with carefully measured wood. Doors were open less often because every opening released warmth that had been difficult to gather. Before nightfall, a householder might inspect the threshold for gaps and press straw mosscloth or sheep's wool between the frame and the wall. A hanging made from coarse fabric could be fixed inside the entrance. Such measures were practical, but winter also encouraged ritual protection. Green branches might be placed above the lintel during the Christmas season, reminding the household that life endured while fields lay bare. Holly, ivy, yew bay and other evergreens appeared in seasonal customs, though their exact meanings varied. Churchmen sometimes approved greenery as festive decoration, and sometimes warned against practices they considered pagan or superstitious. No one can quite agree how much ordinary villagers separated older household habits from Christian celebration. A branch brought from the churchyard or woodland could represent blessing, good fortune, memory, or simply the welcome sight of green leaves in a grey season. The 12 days around Christmas were often treated as unusual time. Work rhythms changed, food was shared more generously when stores allowed, and visitors crossed thresholds carrying greetings, songs, or requests for hospitality. In some communities, the identity of the first person to enter a house after a significant feast or at the beginning of a new year was thought to influence the household's fortune. The desirable visitor differed from place to place. A healthy man might be preferred in one region, while a dark-haired caller or someone bearing fuel, bread, salt, or greenery was welcomed in another. These customs are better documented in later centuries, and historians continue to debate how securely they can be placed in the medieval period. Yet the underlying belief that beginnings mattered was deeply familiar. The first furrow, the first loaf, the first bell, and the first foot across a threshold could shape expectations for what followed. Doors were also important during harvest. When the final sheaf came from the field, it might be decorated, carried home, or treated with special respect. Some communities believed that the spirit or strength of the crop remained within the last grain. A small bundle could be preserved through winter and placed near the house barn or table before being mixed with seed for the following year. The precise ceremonies differed widely, and many surviving descriptions come from periods later than the Middle Ages. Still, harvest customs often connected fields with entrances. Grain crossed the threshold in sacks and baskets, transforming outdoor labor into winter survival. A household that had gathered enough barley, oats, rye, or wheat could face the cold months with greater confidence. One that had not might listen anxiously whenever a stranger knocked asking for bread. At the end of harvest, floors were swept, stores counted, and doors checked against mice and damp. Grain chests were raised from the earth when possible. Cats moved through barns and kitchens, valued for their work even when surrounded by uncertain beliefs. Rowan thorn or iron might be fixed near a barn entrance to protect livestock and food from theft, illness, or harmful influence. Weddings gave thresholds a happier but equally delicate meaning. A bride entering her husband's household crossed into a new legal, social, and domestic position. She might leave behind the authority of one family and enter the customs of another. Neighbors watched her arrival, and small gestures at the doorway could be remembered for years. She could be welcomed with bread, ale, salt, or grain. In some places she stepped carefully over the sill rather than upon it, for the threshold itself was treated as a boundary not to be disturbed. Whether medieval brides were commonly carried across doorways remains uncertain despite the persistence of the idea in later imagination. More securely, entrances featured in blessings, processions, and public acknowledgements that a new household bond had begun. The bride brought clothing, bedding, chest utensils, or livestock according to her means. These possessions passed through the entrance before being arranged among worn benches, trestle tables, cooking pots, and storage boxes. A wool blanket or linen sheet could represent years of labor. Once placed inside the home, such objects became part of its memory and might later pass to daughters or widowed relatives. Childbirth made a doorway more guarded. The room in which a woman labored was often kept warm and private. Curtains were drawn, shutters closed, and unnecessary visitors discouraged. Female relatives, neighbors, or a midwife attended while men usually remained elsewhere. The household prepared warm water, cloth broth, ale, herbs, and whatever remedies local experience recommended. A charm prayer, relic, girdle, or written sacred phrase might be brought into the room. Some women sought objects associated with saints believed to aid childbirth. Monastic houses and churches occasionally lent holy items for this purpose, though clergy worried when sacred objects were used in ways that resembled magic. Those who practice such customs may have seen no contradiction. In a dangerous labor, every form of protection could seem worthy of trust. The entrance to the birthing room was controlled carefully. Too many people brought noise, cold air, and gossip. A sudden draught was thought capable of harming mother or infant. After birth, the household remained cautious until the mother recovered and the child was baptized. Because infant mortality was high, baptism might take place quickly, requiring the newborn to pass from the guarded room through the household door and along the road toward the church font. Holy days altered entrances once more. Priests sometimes blessed houses, carrying holy water through village lanes. Processions passed crosses, wells, boundary stones and fields, asking protection for crops and community. During rogation days, parishioners walked the edges of their land while prayers were spoken. Doorways along the route opened to watch them pass, connecting each private home with the larger sacred landscape. At midsummer, fires and greenery marked another turning point. Customs involving bonfires, herbs, dew, and protective plants varied, and church authorities did not always approve of them. Smoke from a communal fire might drift across roofs and enter open windows. Certain herbs gathered at a meaningful hour were kept for remedies, or fastened near entrances where they dried slowly through the following months. As autumn returned, daylight shortened and doors closed earlier. The bells of All Saints and All Souls called attention toward the dead. Families remembered names, attended services, and gave alms. Some household customs suggested that the departed remained close during these nights. Food flame prayer or an unbarred passage could express welcome or caution depending on local belief. Outside, mist moved through harvested fields. The village roofs were dark against the evening sky and smoke rose almost straight in the still air. From the church came a slow bell followed by silence. One household fastened a blessed branch above its door. Another traced a cross on the frame. Farther along the lane, someone carried the last basket of apples into storage before lowering the bar. The threshold remained ordinary oak and worn stone, polished by boots, paws, rain, and generations of hands. Yet each season gave it a different duty. It welcomed the bride, guarded, the mother admitted, the harvest turned away winter, and opened for sacred processions. Around it, the village marked the passage of time, not with calendars hanging on walls, but with bells, weather, labour, and repeated customs. When the final candle was extinguished, the protections of the year remained in place, a dried branch above the lintel. Grain stored beyond the door, a prayer folded inside a chest, and a family sleeping beneath wool blankets. Outside, one season passed quietly into another, pausing for a moment at every threshold along the darkened lane. The guarded birthing room and the sick chamber shared a similar unease. Both were places where the ordinary household seemed to pause around a body that had become vulnerable. Work continued beyond the door. Pots simmered, animals shifted in their stalls, and servants crossed the yard with water or firewood. Yet within the room time moved more slowly. Curtains were drawn, voices softened, and every opening in the wall became a matter of concern. A medieval window could offer light and relief, but it could also admit cold dampness noise and the dangerous air people feared. In a sick room, attendants constantly balanced these possibilities. A tightly closed shutter kept out winter wind, though it trapped smoke, sweat, and the odour of medicines. An open window allowed the room to clear, yet exposed the patient to a draught believed capable of driving illness deeper into the body. There was no single rule followed everywhere. Advice varied according to the season, the nature of the illness, and the means of the household. A learned physician might recommend air judged clean and temperate, while an experienced grandmother insisted that the shutter remain fastened until the fever broke. No one can quite agree how often formal medical instruction overruled household custom. In many homes, the decision belonged to whoever remained longest beside the bed. The bed itself offered another form of enclosure. In a prosperous household, curtains hung from a wooden frame around the mattress. They provided privacy and held warmth close to the sleeper. In poorer cottages, cloth might be suspended from a beam, or an old cloak could be hung between the patient and the door. Even a simple screen reduced drafts and separated the sick person from the smoke and movement of the main room. Beds were valuable possessions. Mattresses might be filled with straw wool feathers or a mixture depending upon wealth. Straw was renewed when it became damp or infested, although fresh filling was not always easily available in winter. Linen sheets marked comfort and status, while many slept beneath coarse wool blankets and fur-lined cloaks. A hot stone wrapped in cloth could be placed near the feet, and warmed bricks or vessels of heated water sometimes served a similar purpose. Near the bed stood bowls, cups, spoons, cloths, and small containers of remedies. Warm broth, watered wine ale, honey, or herbal infusions were offered according to the patient's condition. Sage, mint, chamomile, fennel rue, and other plants could be used, though names and preparations differed from place to place. A monastery infirmary possessed a broader collection of herbs than most village homes, but even humble households kept knowledge passed through generations. Windows also mattered because light allowed attendants to judge the face, skin, urine, wounds, and breathing of the patient. Physicians sometimes examined urine in a clear vessel, believing its color sediment, and appearance revealed the body's internal balance. Such examination became a familiar image of medical practice, though it was only one part of diagnosis. In a dim chamber, the vessel might be carried toward the window and held against the daylight. A narrow opening could therefore become an instrument of observation. Morning light revealed whether swelling had changed or whether a wound had darkened. It showed the patient's pallor and allowed linen dressings to be prepared. Yet direct sunlight might be considered too strong for a person weakened by fever, and shutters were adjusted to admit only a soft, controlled glow. Childbirth required similar management. The labouring woman was kept warm because cold was believed to slow or endanger the process. Windows were closed, fires tended, and gaps around shutters stuffed with cloth. Female attendants moved between bed, hearth, and wash basin, warming water and preparing linen. A pot of pottage or broth remained nearby for those waiting through the long hours. The birthing chamber could become crowded. A midwife, female relatives, neighbours, and servants might be present, each offering practical help prayer or remembered advice. Too much conversation could exhaust the mother, but complete silence felt unnatural. Encouragement was given in low voices. Stories of earlier births might be repeated, not always helpfully, while the door remained guarded against unnecessary interruption. Certain objects were brought close to the woman in labour. A relic saint's image, blessed candle, written prayer, or special girdle might be placed beside the bed. Some childbirth girdles consisted of long strips of parchment or cloth bearing prayers and sacred images. They could be wrapped around the body or laid nearby. Church authorities sometimes worried that such objects were being treated as magical, but to the women using them, sacred words and physical comfort belonged to the same hope. Knots could carry symbolic importance. In some customs, knots were loosened clothing unlaced, and bound objects open to encourage the child's passage. Doors, chests, or cupboards might also be opened for the same reason, though evidence is uneven and later traditions may have influenced modern interpretations. Still, the idea followed a simple logic. When the body struggled to open the household removed every sign of binding. This created a curious tension. The window was closed against cold and danger, while other openings within the room were released. A belt was loosened, a braid might be undone, a chest lid stood raised. The main entrance remained and watched, separating the intimate work of birth from the wider household. After the child arrived, the room did not immediately return to normal. Mother and infant remained vulnerable. The fire was kept steady and drafts were avoided. The newborn was wrapped in linen or wool and placed close to warmth. Swaddling cloths were used widely, though methods varied. The child's head might be covered and the cradle positioned away from both door and window. Baptism created urgency because an unbaptized infant who died raised painful spiritual concerns. The child could be carried quickly to church sometimes while the mother remained confined to bed. Godparents accompanied the infant through the household entrance and along the lane beneath rain, snow, or pale morning light. At the font, the child received a name and entered the Christian community before being brought back into the guarded room. Sickness after childbirth was difficult to understand. Fever might be blamed upon retained bodily matter, corrupted air exhaustion, divine judgment, or an ill-timed draught. Remedies included herbs, warming foods, bloodletting, in some circumstances prayer and rest. Many women recovered while others did not, and the household remembered every detail of the room afterward, which shutter had stood open, which candle had failed, and who had crossed the threshold before the fever began. Outside, rain moved gently across the thatch and stone roofs. Water gathered in the ruts of the lane. The church bell marked an hour that those inside the chamber scarcely noticed. Firelight rested upon folded linen, a wooden cradle, and the worn edge of the shutter. The opening in the wall remained both useful and feared. It brought the daylight needed for healing and the air that sometimes refreshed a crowded room. It also represented exposure at the very moment the household wished to close itself protectively around the sick, the mother or the newborn child, and so the shutter was opened only a little, then closed again. A curtain softened its edges, herbs dried beside the frame, and a prayer rested near the bed. Beyond the glass or wooden boards, the village continued beneath the evening sky, while inside, careful hands guarded the fragile distance between danger and recovery. The careful opening of a sickroom shutter belonged to the stillness of home, but along medieval roads, doors and windows presented different questions. A traveller rarely knew what waited beyond them. The same entrance might offer warmth, food, and a dry corner near the hearth, or led into a room where strangers watched every movement, and the host counted each coin before allowing anyone to rest. Roadside inns appeared wherever movement gathered near market towns, bridges, monastery gates, river crossings, pilgrimage routes, and stretches of road too long to travel comfortably in a single day. Some were purpose-built establishments with stables, kitchens, guest chambers, and a painted sign hanging above the entrance. Others were ordinary houses that offered ale food or sleeping space when the road brought enough custom. A traveller approaching at dusk looked first for signs of welcome. Light beneath a shutter suggested that the household was still awake. Smoke rising steadily from the roof promised a fire. The sound of horses in a yard indicated shelter for animals, while the smell of pottage onions or roasting meat suggested that food might still be available. Yet no sign guaranteed kindness or safety. The main door of an inn usually opened into a common hall or drinking room. Benches stood beside trestle tables and rushes covered the floor. Wet cloaks hung from pegs. Clay cups, wooden bowls, and trenchers crowded the tables. Drovers, merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, servants, and local labourers shared the room, though not always peacefully. The host or innkeeper judged each arrival quickly. Clothing revealed something of rank, but travel blurred appearances. A wealthy merchant could arrive covered in mud, while a thief might wear a respectable cloak taken from someone else. A pilgrim badge showed that its owner had visited or claimed to have visited a shrine, but it did not prove honesty. Questions, therefore, came before comfort, where the traveller had started, where he intended to go, whether he carried goods, whether he had companions, and whether he could pay. No one can quite agree how suspicious the ordinary innkeeper was toward every unknown guest. Some depended upon travellers and could not afford to insult them. Others had learned that generosity without caution ended in unpaid meals, missing spoons, stolen horses, or trouble with local officials. Hospitality remained a business even when Christian duty softened its edges. Not every door was meant for every visitor. The broad entrance facing the road admitted guests of recognized standing. A side door near the stable served grooms, drovers, and servants. The kitchen entrance received firewood barrels, vegetables, and carcasses from the butcher. A traveller who entered by the wrong door risked embarrassment, anger, or suspicion. Status lived in architecture. A merchant with letters of credit might expect the front entrance and a place near the main fire. A poor pilgrim could be directed toward an outer room loft or stable shelter. A servant travelling on a noble household's business might be treated according to the importance of the master whose badge or message he carried. The same person could be welcomed warmly at one door and dismissed sharply from another. Women travelling without male companions faced particular scrutiny. Some were pilgrims, widows, traders, or women moving between relatives. Others worked around inns as cooks, ale sellers, laundresses, or attendants. Yet rumour easily attached itself to a woman entering a lodging house after dark. She might choose a side entrance for privacy, only to find that the same choice encouraged gossip. Inn windows offered their own risks. A ground floor shutter left open allowed passers-by to see coins changing hands, purses tucked beneath belts, and merchants discussing goods. Thieves could study the room before deciding whom to follow. A traveller seated near the window therefore enjoyed fresher air but less privacy. Upper chambers, when they existed, were not always secure. Several guests might share one room, one bed, or a row of straw pallets. A chest could be placed against the door and a purse tucked beneath clothing or bedding. Boots were kept close, partly to prevent theft and partly because a sudden departure might be necessary if firefighting or alarm disturbed the night. Some travellers carried small locks for chests or leather bags. Others threaded bells through straps so movement would make a sound. Merchants sometimes slept with account books and letters close to the body, for the loss of written proof could be as serious as the loss of coin. A pilgrim might place a staff across the doorway not because it could stop a determined intruder, but because anyone entering would have to disturb it. Bridges and toll gates created another set of entrances. Many bridges had watchposts, gates, chapels, or fortified towers at one end. A traveller arriving after the gate closed might be forced to wait until morning. River crossings could be dangerous in darkness, and toll keepers guarded both revenue and passage. The toll itself varied according to the traveller and cargo. A cart of wool, a herd of pigs, a basket of fish, or a pack horse carrying wine could each be charged differently. Disputes arose when collectors demanded more than custom allowed, or when travellers claimed exemptions they could not prove. Monasteries, nobles, towns, and merchants sometimes possessed written privileges, granting reduced tolls, but producing a sealed document in rain and darkness was not always simple. At certain gates, a smaller doorway allowed pedestrians to pass after the main cart entrance had closed. This wicket could be useful, but it also placed the traveller close to the guard who might ask questions, demand payment, or refuse entry. A lone stranger standing outside a town wall after sunset had little power to argue. Crossing the wrong threshold could carry legal danger. Some inns had reputations for sheltering thieves, deserters, smugglers, or unlicensed gamblers. A traveller entering unknowingly might later be questioned by the town watch. In districts troubled by robbery, authorities sometimes required hosts to report suspicious guests or take responsibility for theft occurring under their roofs. The innkeeper therefore watched unfamiliar bundles and whispered conversations. A blood-stained cloak might belong to a butcher, hunter, wounded soldier, or criminal. A sealed letter could contain royal business or a private lie. A guest who refused to name his destination invited attention, though a prudent merchant might conceal his route to avoid robbery. Belief added another layer of caution. Travellers carried stories of inns built near gallows, abandoned chapels, or crossroads where the restless dead were said to wander. Some lodging houses kept blessed branches, iron objects, or saints' images near the entrance. A horseshoe might be fixed above a stable door, though historians continue to debate the age and meaning of many such customs. Roadside shrines offered reassurance before arrival. A traveller might stop at a cross or small chapel, leave a coin, touch a carved image, or speak a brief prayer for safe lodging. Pilgrim badges and amulets hung from cloaks, catching the last light as the road entered the trees. Outside the inn, rain began to fall upon the yard. Horses shifted beneath the stable roof and water dripped from saddles and packs. In the common room, the fire lowered, conversation softened, and the host made a final circuit of the doors. The stable entrance was barred. The kitchen latch was checked. A shutter facing the road was pulled tight against the wind. Those already inside settled among strangers. Some slept near friends, others beside people whose names they would never learn. The walls offered shelter but not complete trust. Every creak of the stair, every lifted latch, and every footstep in the passage carried the possibility of an innocent servant, a late traveller, or something less welcome. Beyond the shutters, the muddy road continued into darkness, passing the toll gate, the bridge, and the distant watchfire. By dawn, the guests would rise, tighten their cloaks, collect their animals, and pass outward through the proper door. Until then, the inn held them together beneath one roof, divided by rank caution, and the quiet hope that no one had chosen the wrong entrance. A traveller might leave the inn at first light and never learn why the host refused to open a certain side door, yet those who lived nearby often knew at least one explanation. Perhaps a quarrel had ended there many winters ago. Perhaps a servant had fallen from the step, a thief had been caught beside the latch, or a body had once been found beneath the window. Over time, the event itself became uncertain, but the entrance retained its reputation. Medieval communities remembered places as much as people. A bend in the road recalled an ambush. A field carried the name of a forgotten owner. A tree marked the place where an oath had been sworn. Doors, windows, wells, bridges, and stairways gathered similar memories because daily life repeatedly passed around them. A doorway worn by generations could outlast every witness to the event that made it feared. Oak boards might be repaired, hinges replaced, and the threshold stones smoothed by countless boots, yet the warning survived in speech. Children were told not to use that entrance after dark. New servants learned to carry water through the kitchen instead. Visitors noticed the inconvenience, but rarely received a complete answer. No one can quite agree how many avoided doors began with a real misfortune. Local stories changed easily because few were written down. A fall from a step became a mysterious death. A theft became murder. An illness beginning near an open shutter was remembered as something entering through it. Each generation altered the tale slightly, often without intending to deceive. Accidents were common around medieval entrances. Steps were uneven passageways, narrow, and floors slippery with mud rushes, spilled ale or grease from the kitchen. A person carrying a heavy basket could stumble over a raised sill. A servant descending an unlit stair might miss the final step. In winter, ice formed outside doors where water had been thrown into the yard. If someone died after such an accident, the entrance became more than a faulty piece of construction. It marked the final moment of an ordinary life. A widow passing it each morning remembered where her husband had fallen. A household might repair the stone yet continue to avoid it, for grief was not mended as easily as masonry. Violent events left still deeper impressions. Family disputes could erupt around inheritance, marriage, tenancy, or unpaid debt. A doorway was a natural place for confrontation, because it separated the person demanding entrance from the person refusing it. Harsh words spoken across a threshold could be heard by neighbours and repeated at the manor court. Records from medieval courts preserve many quarrels involving fences, animals, damaged crops, assault, and property boundaries. They rarely explain every emotion behind them. A man fined for striking a neighbour near a doorway may have carried years of resentment. A woman accused of insulting another at a window may have been defending her household from repeated intrusion. The written line recorded the offence while village memory supplied the story. An entrance associated with betrayal could be distrusted for generations. Perhaps a gate had been opened secretly during a feud. Perhaps a servant admitted thieves. Perhaps a family member left through it after abandoning an oath. The practical danger ended when the people involved died, but the doorway remained as visible proof that safety had once failed. In castles, such memories attached themselves to posterns and hidden stairs. A small gate said to have admitted attackers might be sealed with stone. Later, servants unaware of the event's details spoke of voices behind the wall or cold air passing through the blocked arch. The physical scar invited a story, and the story explained why the masonry looked different. Monasteries had their own remembered entrances. A gate through which an excommunicated person had been expelled might acquire solemn significance. A door connected with a disgraced abbot, a stolen relic or a fire could remain unused even after repairs. Monks lived within traditions of written memory, yet formal chronicles and spoken accounts did not always agree. One emphasized sin and punishment, while another blamed a faulty lamp or careless porter. In villages, reputation often travelled through women's work and evening conversation. While spinning wool, mending clothing, preparing herbs, or sorting grain, people repeated stories linked to familiar houses. A daughter learned why her mother never opened the western shutter during storms. A new bride heard that the rear door had once been used during a funeral. A servant carrying trenchers from the hall was warned not to knock 3 times upon a certain frame. The number 3 possessed sacred associations through the Trinity, but repeated knocks could also feel ominous in later folklore. Whether such beliefs were common in the medieval period remains uncertain. Still, numbers, gestures, and repeated actions often gave structure to warnings. A caution was easier to remember when attached to a precise rule. Sometimes the original reason was entirely practical. A door might lead onto land claimed by another family. Using it could suggest a rite of passage and reignite a legal dispute. A window could overlook a neighbour's yard, encouraging accusations of spying or damaged privacy. Rather than explain the complicated history each time, households simply called the opening unlucky and kept it closed. Manor courts dealt with boundaries, paths, ditches, hedges, and access rights because these shaped survival. A doorway opening onto the wrong strip of ground could cause years of conflict. If one household blocked an old path, another might insist that ancestors had always used it. Witnesses recalled customs from decades before, though memory became less reliable with age. Such disputes often outlived those who began them. Children inherited not only fields and houses, but grievances. An entrance became a symbol of insult. The door built without permission, the window cut into a shared wall, or the gate through which animals repeatedly escaped. Even after settlement, no one wished to use it casually. Religious meaning could also be added afterward. A priest might bless a troubled house, sprinkle holy water near the entrance, or recommend prayers after an unexplained event. If peace followed, the blessing became part of the doorway's history. A cross carved into the frame reminded later occupants that protection had once been needed, though they no longer knew why. Small objects reinforced the legend. A rusted nail beneath the sill, a dried sprig hidden above the lintel, or a worn shoe discovered during repair seemed to confirm that earlier residents had feared something. The object might originally have been placed for a different reason, but once found it became evidence within the local tale. The reputation of a window could survive even after the view beyond it changed. A gallows was removed, a churchyard wall rebuilt, or a forest cleared for fields. Yet the shutter still remained closed at night because grandparents remembered when the landscape had been different. The fear no longer matched what stood outside, but it matched the story attached to the room. At evening, these old explanations settled naturally into household routine. A servant lowered the bar without asking why. A child avoided the step worn darker than the others. The family ate smoked fish, coarse bread, and pottage beneath the glow of a tallow candle while wind moved around the unused door. Beyond the roofs, bells faded across winter fields. Mist covered the path that generations had walked, and a watchfire burned beside the distant road. Inside, the avoided entrance remained silent, holding no visible danger, only the weight of remembered accidents, arguments, funerals, and warnings. Perhaps nothing had ever happened there exactly as the story claimed. Perhaps every detail was true. The household did not need certainty. It needed only another entrance, another path, and a reason to leave the old one undisturbed. By the time the last story about an avoided doorway had been told beside the hearth, the medieval household was already preparing to close itself for the night. Supper bowls had been scraped clean, the final pieces of coarse bread gathered from the trenches, and the remaining ale covered against dust. Somewhere near the wall, a servant shook damp mud from a cloak while another carried an armful of wood toward the fire. The day had entered through every opening in the house. It had come with the smell of wet fields, the voices of neighbours, the tolling of bells, the arrival of merchants, and the footsteps of people returning from manor work. Now, those same openings had to be secured against darkness. The main door was usually attended first. Someone lifted the wooden bar from where it rested during the day and placed it across the heavy planks. In a prosperous house, iron bolts slid into their sockets, and a key turned within a carefully made lock. In a poorer cottage, a wooden latch, a peg, and the weight of a bench might provide all the protection available. Each fastening was tested by habit. The door was pulled once to make certain it held. The lower hinge was examined if it had been troublesome in wet weather. A bundle of cloth or wool was pressed into a gap where the wind had begun to enter. No one needed to speak about these tasks. They belonged to the closing of the day as naturally as covering the fire or folding a blanket. The shutters followed. One after another they were drawn over the windows, shutting away the churchyard, the lane, the empty market stalls, and the fields beyond the village. A wooden pin held each panel in place. Where the boards had warped, a cord might be tied around the frame or a stool pushed beneath the latch. A person standing at the final open window could still see the last colour above the western trees. Smoke rose from neighbouring roofs. A lantern moved briefly near the church porch, then disappeared behind stone. Farther away, a shepherd crossed the winter field with his dog, both becoming darker as the evening deepened. No one can quite agree how much fear accompanied this nightly closing. For many households it was simply practical work. Doors kept out thieves, animals, and cold. Shutters preserved warmth and privacy. Yet practical acts could still carry older meanings, especially when performed in the same order for generations. A hand might touch the cross cut into the lintel. A dried branch blessed months before remained above the frame. An iron nail rested beside the latch, darkened by smoke and repeated touch. Beneath the floor, perhaps an old shoe or folded prayer waited in silence, unknown even to those who trusted in its protection. The house was not truly sealed. Air entered beneath the thatch and through the mortar. Smoke drifted around the beams. Rain found weak points in the roof, and mice knew passages no builder had intended. The medieval home remained open to the world in countless small ways, yet the visible doors and windows had been closed, and that was enough to create a feeling of shelter. In castles, guards completed the same work on a grander scale. The main gates had already shut beneath the gatehouse arch. Chains, bars, and locks secured the postern. A watchman carrying a lantern crossed the inner yard, pausing to look toward the walls. Stable doors were fastened, kitchen entrances checked, and tower stairways left to darkness. In monasteries, the porter rested near the gate after the final visitor had been admitted or turned away. The keys hung where they could be reached if illness, fire, or urgent news disturbed the night. Within the cloister, the community moved beneath the authority of bells. A final office ended, sandals whispered over stone, and the brothers withdrew toward their sleeping places. On the pilgrimage road, inns gathered strangers behind their own barred doors. Horses breathed within the stable. Packs rested against walls, and merchants slept close to their purses. A poor traveller lay among the rushes beneath a borrowed wool blanket, grateful for any roof while rain passed over the road outside. Across villages and estates, hundreds of small boundaries were being secured. A widow lowered a latch in a timber cottage. A cook tied the kitchen shutter against the wind. A manor servant carried a beeswax candle through the hall, checking entrances his grandparents might also have known. A mother moved an infant's cradle farther from the door before covering the child carefully. The quiet that followed was never complete. Oak contracted near the fire and creaked. Wind touched the shutters. Rats moved behind stored grain. An animal shifted in an adjoining stall. The sounds were familiar enough to allow sleep, though an unusual knock could still cause every listener to become still. Sometimes a branch scraped repeatedly against a wall. Sometimes a loose latch rose slightly, then dropped. Such sounds could be explained by weatherware and imperfect construction. Even now, historians continue to debate how often medieval people interpreted ordinary noises as signs of supernatural danger. It is likely that most knew their homes too well to fear every creak, yet knowledge did not remove all mystery. Darkness beyond the door concealed the road, the graveyard, the forest, and the stranger who might be walking between them. The shutter protected the sleeper not only from what was outside, but from the need to keep watching it. Firelight slowly faded within the room. The bright edges of benches, bowls, and iron tools softened into shadow. Faces disappeared beneath blankets and cloaks. The charm above the doorway, so carefully placed, became invisible. The old threshold lay empty, holding no footsteps for a few quiet hours. Outside, mist crossed the fields and gathered along the muddy road. The market square stood deserted beneath the church tower. A roadside shrine received the rain without witness. Beyond the village, the manor house, abbey castle, and forest settled into the same darkness, each protected by walls that were strong in some places and fragile in others. A distant bell marked the hour. Its sound passed over sleeping roofs, through bare trees, and across land where generations had opened and closed the same doors. The people who first feared a particular shutter were already forgotten. The reason one entrance had been avoided might fade while the custom remained. Then the custom too would disappear, leaving only a blocked arch, an unusual mark in the wood, or an old object hidden within a wall. Time would replace oak planks, rebuild houses, widen windows, and bury ancient thresholds beneath newer floors. Roads would shift, churchyards would fill, castles would become ruins, monasteries would fall silent, and village stories would change until their beginnings could no longer be recovered. Still, for this final moment, the medieval world remains gently closed around its sleeping people. The bars are lowered, the shutters are secure. The last ember glows beneath ash, preserving a little warmth for morning. No traveller approaches, no hand tests the latch, and no shadow waits beyond the frame. There is only the quiet road, the soft rain, the distant bell, and the memory of generations who understood that every home needed a boundary between its small circle of firelight and the wide uncertainty of night. The bell fades, the watchfires grow dim, and behind their old doors and shuttered windows the villages sleep.